So welcome back from that short break. And this second parallel session, the purpose is to explore in more depth the unique history and dynamics of select drug and conflict-affected borderland regions in Afghanistan, Colombia, and Myanmar. For the Colombia session, we've decided to focus on Puerto Asis, a municipality in the department of Putumayo. I will be presenting alongside my colleague Camilo Acero, who worked full-time with the National University on the Drugs and Disorder Project from its inception period until just a few months ago. So that would be just Camilo and I speaking today. A number of us conducted fieldwork in Putumayo as part of the Drugs and Disorder Project. And it's important to emphasize the contribution of our other colleagues to the work in Putumayo. They are Diana Machuca, Monica Parada, Howard Rojas, Gustavo Pozo, and Linda Ordóñez. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide, please. So before focusing in on Puerto Asis, I'd like to say a bit about the underpinnings of this session. The Drugs and Disorder team has been working on a series of Borderland biographies with the aim of situating drugs within the wider historical, political, economic, and social cultural context of the borderland regions we're studying. In this way, we challenge the drugs fetishism that predominates in many academic and policy circles, the tendency to analyze drug-producing regions only through the lens of drugs. We do not assume that drugs have intrinsic properties which make their impacts homogeneous. Instead, we seek to uncover the ways that drug economies shape and are shaped by the context in which they're embedded. This involves listening and learning from the experiences and perspectives of borderland inhabitants themselves. Next slide, please. So our presentation today consists of 4 parts. First, we're going to give some basic information about the location and borders of Putumayo and Puerto Asis. Next, we're going to give a historical overview of the region, drawing on secondary sources, and for later periods from the 1980s onwards, our own research as well. Third, we focus on a more specific story, that of the interrelationship between the cocoa economy and access to land. And finally, we focus on the interrelationship between the cocoa economy and state-citizen relations in Lower Putumayo. Next slide, please. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Colombian geography, Puerto Asis is a town and municipality within the department, which is like a province or state of Putumayo, which shares borders with Ecuador and Peru. As you can see on the map, a small portion of Putumayo in the northwest lies in the Andean geographical zone. This area is known as Upper Putumayo. And from there, the mountains unfold southeast into the Amazon lowlands, which account for 85% of the Putumayo territory, including the 2,600 square kilometers that comprise the municipality of Puerto Asis. Next slide, please. So the borders which today define Putumayo stabilized only around the 1950s, and Putumayo didn't become a department until 1991. Before that, Putumayo was part of what is known as the National Territory, which meant that the central government selected regional and local authorities. Those appointed were often outsiders with little or no connections to or knowledge of Putumayo. The old Intendancy and Commissariat of Putumayo included at different moments in time parts of what is now Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, and the Colombian department of Amazonas. These intendancies and commissariats were frequently created and dissolved, so during the first half of the 20th century, areas of what is today Putumayo were passed back and forth between different jurisdictions, such as the departments of Cauca, Nariño, Pasto, and the Special Commissariat of Caquetá, which you should be able to see on the screen, on the slide. So these political administrative changes are illustrated there, and the most recent commissariat of Putumayo was created in 1957. It became an intendancy in 1968, and finally, as I said before, a department in 1991. Next slide, please. In the case of Puerto Asis, the municipal boundaries didn't stabilize until much later. Puerto Asis, which became a municipality in 1967, originally included the territories of what are now neighboring municipalities of Orito, Valle de Guames, and San Miguel. Orito separated from Puerto Asis and became its own municipality in 1978 or 79. At the time, Orito included the Valle de Guames and San Miguel, so they later separated then from Orito. And according to Debbie Acosta, this and many other political administrative changes within the region were at least partially motivated by interest in capturing and controlling oil royalties. And we'll talk about the oil economy in a bit. But first, over to Camilo.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk about a little bit about the historical overview of the region of Putumayo. Next one. So humans inhabited the Putumayo region as far as back as 10,000 years ago, but it's difficult to access a history told by its original inhabitants, and most accounts draw on the narrative of conquistadors, explorers, and settlers. The Spanish invaded the Putumayo region in the 16th century. They sent missionaries to convert indigenous people to Catholicism, but also as a strategy of territorial control. The missionaries' presence was strongest in Upper Putumayo, in and around the Sibundoy Valley. The Spanish were unable to subjugate the territories and peoples of the Amazonian foothills and rainforest. State-backed missions were reinstated after independence, as explained by Simón Uribe. The missionaries were authorized to fill on for the state. They were given civil, judiciary, and police power over the indigenous peoples. As in the past, they achieved a more stable and stronger presence in the temperate areas of Upper Putumayo compared to the Amazonian flatlands. That said, the missionaries played a fundamental role in the early settlement of Lower Putumayo. Next slide, please. The Capuchin missionaries organized construction of the road connecting the Andes Mountains and the Amazon lowlands. The first segment of the road runs from Pasto to Putumayo's capital, Mocoa. It was completed in 1912, and the segment between Mocoa, the capital city, and Puerto Asis was completed in 1931. The road, which was initially little more than a mule path, was traveled by thousands of colonos or peasant settlers who established on nearby lands. The population of settlers in Putumayo grew rapidly in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, while the number of indigenous inhabitants declined by more than half. Next, please. Beyond the Catholic missions, it was successive resource booms that defined the uneven transformation of Putumayo. First, it was quina bark used for the production of quinine, which at the time was the only known effective treatment for malaria. The extraction of quina bark from the region's forest expanded between 1850 and 1885. During this period, quinine businessman Rafael Reyes, later to become president of Colombia, initiated navigation of the Putumayo River in steamboats. Trade routes also developed on land, and mestizo settlements expanded along them. The population of Mocoa, which was declared a regional center of commerce for quina, grew considerably. Just as the quina bonanza was ending around 1890, the Amazonian rubber boom began. The Casa Arana Rubber Company, later known as the Peruvian Amazonan Company, expanded its control over a vast expanse of land around the Putumayo River, mostly in territories disputed between Colombia and Peru. The company's expansion contributed to tensions between the two countries, which led to a brief military conflict between 1932 and 1933. The toll of the brief Peru and Colombia conflict was small compared to the terror within the company's empire. The functionaries of Casa Arana enslaved, starved, raped, tortured, and massacred several indigenous communities. Some 100,000 people were killed. Next one. As the rubber boom fizzled out, new push and pull factors elicited interest in Putumayo. The completion of the road to Puerto Asis in 1931 facilitated migration to southeastern areas. Meanwhile, dispossession and other processes of property concentration in the nearby departments of Nariño and Cauca forced many mestizo campesinos and indigenous communities to Putumayo in search of land. Displacement during a period of civil war known as La Violencia drove further colonization of the region, though, according to some authors, this was much less important than other factors, such as nearby land concentration. Most families established as subsistence farmers. Others were drawn to gold panning, logging, and hunting for marketable animal skins. In the early 20th century, the missionaries and the Navy offered some assistance to Putumayo's newly arriving colonists. However, for most of the part, it was settlers who were already established that helped the newcomers, providing temporary shelter and food, lending them tools, and sometimes assisting them with the building of their new homes. Next one. Putumayo's first oil rush stimulated yet another wave of migration. Petroleum exploration in Putumayo dates back to 1940s, but it was more than 20 years before Texaco drilled the first well in Orito in 1963. People from across the country traveled to Putumayo in search of work with the oil company or attracted by the commercial opportunities implied by their presence. The population of Puerto Asis and surrounding areas grew from 8,000 inhabitants in 1956 to more than 16,000 in 1973. A number of settlements, including Orito, La Hormiga, El Tigre, and San Miguel, were established during the oil rush, while Puerto Asis, originally founded as a small missionary settlement in 1912, became a commercial hub. Oil production started to decline in the early 1970s. Texaco sold off its interest in the region, though Ecopetrol, the Colombian state oil company, continued exploration and some fields were developed in the 90s. Oil activities didn't truly take off again in the Putumayo until around 2005. The construction frenzy that had marked the previous decade faded, and with it, the demand for labor that had drawn so many to Putumayo. Though some people opted to abandon the region, the decline of the oil economy did not result in the population, as might be imagined. In fact, according to the National Center of Historical Memory, between 1973 and 1985, the population of Lower Putumayo increased by an estimate of 725%, and this rapid demographic growth in Lower Putumayo was at least partially a result of the migratory pull engendered by a budding coca economy. Francis.
Okay, so commercial coca production began in Putumayo just as oil exploitation slowed. The first coca crops are said to have been established in Puerto Asis around 1978. Both the Cali and the Medellin cartels established processing laboratories in the area. And then coca production expanded throughout the 1980s across all of Lower Putumayo. Before then, settlers mostly produced for subsistence. Some also sold maize and rice to the State Agricultural Marketing Board, IDEMA, but the market for maize and rice collapsed. And coincidentally, according to our informants, around the same time as coca cultivation took off, IDEMA was slowly dismantled and eventually liquidated in the 1990s. And the quote on the slide is from one leader who sort of tells this story. He says, IDEMA bought our produce, and there was a company from Caquetá and a number of mills in Puerto Asis where they purchased the rice people brought. There was so much production at one time that it would rot. IDEMA had big tents on the street to collect maize. They would pay the producer months later. I don't know what problems there were with the government because the government was in charge of that when coca rice production was finished off and there was very little maize. So by the year 2000, Putumayo was producing around 40% of Colombia's coca crops. And for Putumayo's campesinos, coca was and still is the ideal cash crop. It grows well in Amazonian soils. Coca paste can be stored and transported easily, even from remote areas with no roads. And unlike the case with licit produce, it is not difficult to find a buyer for coca paste. Coca paste prices are relatively stable and typically allow for a small profit. Next slide, please. But the coca economy brought new forms of violence to Putumayo. In the 1980s, narco traffickers working for the Cali and Medellin cartels fought for control over the coca economy in Puerto Asis. The Medellin cartel, under the leadership of Rodriguez Gacha, who's pictures there, prevailed, and tensions also arose between the narco-traffickers and the EPL and FARC rebel groups, which had been present in the region since the beginning of the 1980s. So around the same time as these local quarrels, the Medellin cartel launched an anti-communist crusade across the country. Some of the cartel's key members had formed a paramilitary group called MAS, Muerte a Secuestradores, or sometimes called Los Macetos, which began to collaborate with the army and the police in a dirty war against the rebels and, above all, civilians accused of supporting the insurgency. So inhabitants of Lower Putumayo began to organize protests and denounce the paramilitary violence and denounce the complicity of state forces in this violence. A combination of civilian action and battles with the guerrillas led to the expulsion of the narco paramilitaries, and this combined with the demobilization of the EPL guerrillas, and in 1991 allowed then the FARC to consolidate power in Putumayo. And this is how one community leader told the story. He said, the FARC ensured itself here with the removal of the group MAS, which had its operations base in El Azul. So when the people couldn't take it anymore because of the harm they did, the guerrilla arrived with the objective of helping the people by removing them. The people started to live in a different environment from 1990 until 1997, when they, the narco paramilitaries, came to retake the zone. Next slide, please. So the FARC established controls over the illicit drug business. They taxed the intermediaries or buyers and owners of large processing laboratories. They prohibited the payment of workers, in particular the cocoa pickers with bazuco, or unrefined cocaine paste. And for a time, they also imposed minimum prices that favored the cocoa farmers. Inhabitants often refer to the benefits of law and order that came with FARC dominance. The quote on the slide is just one example. She said, here in the past, conflicts were resolved by the government of this place, the FARC. So that's why there wasn't worry that someone would come and take the land. The FARC were the ones with the power here, and they solved those problems. However, the order brought by the FARC was not without cost. Authors such as Maria Clemencia Ramirez show that the guerrilla had a conflicted relationship with social and peasant organizations and sought to exert control over them. Next slide, please. In 1997, different anti-subversive groups from across the country joined together, forming the AUC paramilitaries. In this context, national paramilitary commanders organized to create the AUC South Bloc, Putumayo South Bloc. Groups of men trained in Urabá were sent to Puerto Asis, where they established their first bases in town and surrounding rural areas. By 2001, they had taken control of most urban zones and the main roads in Lower and Middle Putumayo. Here is how one woman described that period. At the end of the 90s, the bodies started to come down the river Putumayo. At first, we would collect them to give them a proper burial. But they, the paramilitaries, said that if we kept doing that, we would end up the same. So we stopped. More and more bodies came down the river. In the beginning, we would lament each death. But with time, things changed. We became insensitive. The bodies would get stuck upriver. That river water was the same that we used in the house. I was worried about giving that contaminated water to my daughters. We used to have to go and dislodge the bodies with a stick. Next slide, please. So the paramilitary takeover in Putumayo overlapped with the implementation of Plan Colombia, a US assistance package first approved in 2000, allegedly for counter-narcotics purposes. Plan Colombia permitted a huge boost in military operations in Putumayo. The military and paramilitary offensives included attacks on the population as a whole. Civilians were subjected to bombardments, aerial fumigations of their crops, massacres, selective assassinations, disappearances, torture, rape, and forced displacement. The FARC responded by upping its own military actions, planting landmines and attacking army camps and bases, as well as oil infrastructure, again victimizing the civilian population. In effect, this period in the early to mid-2000s was the most violent in Putumayo's recent history, and Puerto Asis was at the center of this violence. Next slide, please. The Putumayo South Bloc of the AUC officially demobilized in March 2006, but as in other areas of the country, paramilitary successor groups emerged to take their place. Meanwhile, state forces continued to battle with the FARC for control over the region, among other reasons with the aim of ensuring the expansion of Putumayo's commercial oil operations, which reignited in the 2000s. Despite the creation of new military bases and units across Putumayo under Plan Colombia, many which had the explicit aim of protecting the department's oil industry, the presence and actions of the FARC remained a threat and obstacle to the sector. It's worth highlighting that the oil industry is central to understanding the dynamics of violence in Putumayo, something that's often overlooked by those overly focused on the drug economy. The testimony on the slide is illustrative of this. The army started to hassle us when the oil company arrived, more or less since the Uribe era. 6 months after the oil company was established, the soldiers tortured people to make them sing or provide information. There was one man they shot in the ears. They burnt him with cigarettes on his testicles. I remember one of the young men they got. He was a noble worker. They'd been trying to build the oil platform since the year 2000, but the guerrillas kept knocking it down. Then they stopped knocking it down and started imposing a tax of 50%. The company didn't accept, and that's when the military strengthened, and then came the repression. They built the military base in 2002 to protect the oil company, and since then there is no peace. Next slide, please. The dynamics of the conflict in the coke economy in Putumayo have changed again since the signing of the 2016 peace agreement. The vast majority of FARC combatants handed over their weapons and remain unarmed, but there were splinter groups that refused to disarm, including the entire First Front, which traditionally operated in the south of the country, especially Guaviare. Other fighters rearmed. In Putumayo, some of these FARC dissidents, as they're often called, joined up with their former adversaries, a paramilitary successor group. This fusion of former members of the 48th Front of the FARC and narco-traffickers and former paramilitaries was once called the Mafia and now is called Comandos de la Frontera. Another group of former FARC combatants formed the Carolina Ramirez Front, which is allied with the First Front. Los Comandos and the Carolina Front entered into a territorial dispute, pitting former comrades in arms against one another and bringing the civilian population into their conflict. Meanwhile, more than 2,800 families in Puerto Asis uprooted their coca bushes under the National Illicit Crop Substitution Program PENIS that Maria Alejandra was speaking about earlier, and that was created as part of the peace agreement. Cash payments were that were supposed to temporarily compensate the loss of income ended in 2019, and the actual substitution projects haven't yet begun. Participants survive each day however they can, and many have been forced to sell their cattle and other assets they acquired with their coca incomes. In 2019 and 2020, people's patience had already begun to wear thin. They told us, if coca makes a comeback in Puerto Asis, the government will only have itself to blame. Back to Camilo.
Next one, please. So with the historical overview complete, we are going to focus in on specific questions. And first, about the interrelationship between the coca economy and the state citizens' relations. And a lot of what I'm going to say is based on an article we wrote for a special issue in Third World Quarterly. So if you would like to know more, please check it out. And the article's bibliography also has a fuller list of secondary sources, some of which I will mention today. Next one, please. So as detailed by many, the central state has no long presented Putumayo as a lawless territory. The emergence of the coca economy served to reinforce this narrative. The war on drugs is one of the responses to this alleged lawlessness. William Ramirez highlights the effect of the government decision to put campesinos and their coca crops at the center of its war on drugs. It effectively criminalized a large group that was already marginalized and, in doing so, transformed the rural inhabitants of the borderlands into an illicit peasantry. The construction of an illicit peasantry was compounded by the tying of counter-narcotics and counter-insurgency in government preaching, policy, and practice. For years, campesinos living in rebel-controlled areas, especially coca growers, have been portrayed as and treated like the insurgents' puppets or accomplices. The impact of this double criminalization on state-citizen relations in frontier territories has been profound. In Puerto Asis, citizens demand on the state, including to be recognized as citizens, and have been channeled through the Cocalero movement, as illustrated so clearly by Maria Clemencia Ramirez. Contrary to what one might expect, Cocaleros in Putumayo have not become enemies of the state, but rather demand its presence. As a matter of fact, they blame its absence and neglect for the existence of the coca economy. Next one, please. Interestingly, cocaleros and functionaries of the central state both emphasize state absence as the main problem in coca growing regions and more state as the solution. There is an important difference, however. Many state functionaries focus on law enforcement, whereas the cocaleros and progressive allies in politics understand more state to mean more public services rather than more police and army. Something like this was imagined by the politicians who negotiated peace with the FARC. They spoke of bringing the state to the remote regions. But the cocaleros aren't just demanding more state. They are demanding a different kind of state, changes in policy, and a different kind of relationship with the state authorities. And nowhere it is clearer than when cocaleros speak about their experiences and perceptions of law enforcement. What their account suggests is that state weakness in drug-producing areas is a problem of quality and not only quantity. Their stories unveil the contradiction of state-building efforts. In a rush to impose authority in territories typically deemed lawless, the government actually ends up undermining the foundation of its legitimacy, which is the basis of any form of authority. Next one, please. One of the most prominent themes in Cocalero's portrayal of law enforcement, unsurprisingly, is forced eradication, manual and especially aerial. The government started fumigating Putumayo in 1997. By 2001, with the implementation of Plan Colombia, they had extended this operation across the department. From then on, people experienced frequent fumigation all the way until 2015. When inhabitants talk about that time, the expression changes. It was very hard, a struggle, horrible, disastrous, a social crisis. The glyphosate cocktail dispersed by the planes and the wind affected rivers, forests, wetlands, and farmers' homes, pastures, and legal crops, as well as coca. From one day to the next, farmers found themselves without a way to feed their families, to service their debts, to pay for medical expenses, or to buy their children's school supplies. Even those not directly involved in the coca economy suffered. Take Doña Emma, a cocalero leader, and her husband. They stopped cultivating coca in the mid-2000s after being shot at an incident they believed was linked to someone coveting their crop. They moved to another sub-district and after paying off their land debts, vowed to stay away business. For the last 13 years, they have mostly relied on cattle rearing. Still, the fumigation made a deep imprint on their lives. They risked their cattle dying if they ate affected grass, and the affected pastures will turn yellow and will have to be replanted, with all the costs this implied. Other sources of income were also lost. The year 2006 in particular was really difficult, she said. Here we quote from one of our interviews with her. She said, "We didn't cultivate coca, but there was coca in the hamlet, and my partner worked planting and wearing pastures, and it was people who worked with coca that paid him. There was a time, the fumigation of 2006, a fumigation operation that was so harsh, and they finished all, even with our food, because we had plantain yuca, and all that was finished up, so I went to town to work. I ended up there for 6 years. I sent a bit of money back to my partner, and the rest I kept for me and my 5 children that I still have with me, because I'm a mother of 9. I hope that government takes a look at the harm it does us, because fumigation harms everything, the water, the animals. Glyphosate is bad for everything. That stuff, it even gives us cancer. In one of those fumigations, I don't remember which year, they fumigated near Ecuador. What did the Ecuadorian government do? It brought a legal case against Colombia, and Colombia had to pay compensations to Ecuador for that fumigation. Look what Colombia has given us, the Colombians. So forced eradication, both manual and aerial, is effectively an attack on farmers' livelihoods. It is thus unsurprising that these operations generate resentment towards the state. Next one, please. Forced eradication is not the only way the state attacks farmers' livelihoods. Colombian laws and regulations have criminalized manifold practices in the coca world, not just those directly related to coca economy. As one community leader put it, everything peasants do is illegal. The police have confiscated their rice and panela because they lack the relevant phytosanitary and sanitary certificates. The same thing happens with their pigs, which they have to smuggle to local markets. They can fell trees on their own lands, but the multinational oil companies can. The state doesn't provide public infrastructure and services, so they self-provision. But even their community-built roads are deemed illegal. In this way, the war on drugs in Putumayo is perceived as just one element of a wider war on the peasantry. Because the peasantry's everyday experience of law enforcement cannot be neatly separated into different policy boxes, forced eradication should be analyzed within this broader context. The fact that coca growers' livelihoods are under threat from many different directions has implications for state legitimacy. Next slide, please. People often brought up the issue of government confiscation. Doña Emma, for example, told us many residents in her sub-district uprooted their coca under the illicit crop substitution program, PENIS. And when the government failed to provide the promised support, about 20 families in her works dedicated themselves to raising pigs, but then they crash against the reality that they can't take those pigs to town to sell. Why, we asked? Because the police take them. It's as if you were working with coca because you have to bring them hidden, she explained. Antonio brought up the same issue. Some 32 families in his area began raising pigs, but getting them into town to sell is difficult because law enforcement is imposing confiscations, so they risk losing everything. The police usually confiscate pigs and other animals or their meat because their transporter and seller lacks required paperwork. Those who raise animals must register their farm with the Colombian Agricultural Institute, the ICA, and with this register in place, request transport permit to move live animals. Many farmers in Puerto Asis do not have the required paperwork for various reasons, like lack of information or an inability to navigate bureaucratic obstacles. Even if they do have the ICA registration, there are an additional problem. Another entity, INVIMA, regulates the slaughter of animals and the processing, storage, and sale of their meat. There is no longer a certificate slaughterhouse for pigs in Puerto Asis. The facility was closed because it did not meet the new sanitary standards set by the central government. So Don Pablo and many others slaughtered their own pigs to sell on local markets illegally. Confiscation in the name of upholding sanitary and phytosanitary regulations are a clear example of how law enforcement generates resentment whilst also directly perpetuating the coca economy. The quote on the slide is illustrative. The leader said, "This community used to produce a lot of rice, but unfortunately, those legal rats from the town, that's what I call them, will steal the peasants' rice because it's illegal. So on the one hand, there is no market for our goods. And on the other, if one produces for consumption, the police steals it. So we don't have a way out. The only option the state leaves us with is to keep cultivating coca." Next slide, please. So many inhabitants of Puerto Asis and in general in Putumayo perceive law enforcement as a lawfare instead of a public good. In some cases, the law itself is perceived as illegitimate or unfair. But even if the contents of a law or regulation are socially necessary, this is never enough on its own. Suppose that each and every phytosanitary and sanitary rule is imperative to ensure public health. The Colombian government has evidently made insufficient effort to help producers meet the increasingly stringent standards they are imposing. Furthermore, context makes all the difference. In Colombia, many norms are devised by people from the center without attention to the particularities of regions like rural Puerto Asis, where people lack access to safe drinking water and do not have a way to refrigerate perishables because electricity is not available. The result is that many producers face a choice between operating illegally or not at all. Given all the above, police and soldiers could be seen as the unfortunate employees sent to enforce unjust or poorly executed laws. But the way they play their role also impacts the relative legitimacy of the state. Part of the problem is that due to decades of counterinsurgency warfare, many see the rural citizens they are meant to serve as potential enemies and treat them accordingly. Another problem area is the exercise of discretionary power. If a police officer can turn a blind eye for a small fee from the peasant's perspective, he or she could do the same without demanding money in return. In this context, people can easily lose sight if they ever had in the first place, of the objectives underlying the laws and regulations that allegedly justify the actions taken. The whole process becomes about the specific officers showing off their power, humiliating adversaries, or lining their pockets. Next one, please. So the daily operation of law enforcement produces resentment among marginalized citizens with negative consequences for governance in frontier regions. And we reiterate, this is not only about coca. Campesinos' experiences of drug control intertwine with other experiences to influence their perceptions of the state. And the resentment caused by forced eradication and police confiscations extends to other sectors and officials. As one interview asked rhetorically, what can we expect from a state that poisons us with glyphosate? The erosion of state legitimacy then becomes an obstacle to implementing other policies in the coca frontier. In fact, one of the reasons some peasants did not get involved in the recent substitution program was because they do not believe in the state. And sadly, the skeptics seem to have been vindicated and the consequences are likely to be severe. As this leader explained, what the government did during that period especially broke people's trust. And it was really a serious problem that the people lost trust in the institutions and dedicated themselves to working their coca crops without thinking what was happening there. But it's precisely there that they are generating the policies that affect us and don't permit the communities to live in better condition. The people forget that and they start to solve their own problems with coca. They start to build their own roads and bridges and schools and solve their problems with coca money. That's why if the PENIS program fails, it will put us in a situation where it will be difficult to build trust in the people again. They won't believe anymore. They won't believe in the government, and the government will lose all credibility. Next one, please. So to summarize, first, campesinos in Puerto Asis are persecuted for many things, and they do in their everyday lives, not just those directly related to coca economy. Then their experiences and perceptions of law enforcement cannot be neatly separated into different policy boxes. So forced eradication of the illicit crops should be analyzed within this broader context. And finally, the criminalization of peasant livelihoods generates resentment towards the state, undermining its efforts to establish authority in these territories. And this is one way in which the coca economy and drug policies have shaped the state building in Putumayo. Francis.
Okay, so in this final segment of the presentation, I'm going to address the question, how have land-based social relations in Puerto Asis shaped and been shaped by the coca economy? Camilo and I are currently working on 2 papers that touch on this question, and we're happy to share some of our initial analysis with you today. Next slide, please. Our research indicates that the coca economy in Puerto Asis developed in a context of relatively democratic land access and has contributed in important ways to creating and maintaining this access, endowing the same economy with certain egalitarian qualities. Next slide, please. So when coca was introduced in Puerto Asis in the late 1970s, colonization by peasant settlers was ongoing. Indeed, the establishment of new hamlets continued well into the 90s and early 2000s, as shown on the map on the slide. The orange marks the areas of most recent settlement. The colonos enclosed baldios, or untitled state lands, including indigenous territories, as they settled them. It's important to note that while in other parts of the country, the traditional landowning class led or followed the colonos into the agrarian frontier, accumulating property and power as they went, as demonstrated by people like Catherine the Grand, this was not so in Puerto Asis. Lower Putumayo hasn't ever had the same landed elite akin to those found in other regions of Colombia. This is not to say there's been no land accumulation, but the dynamics have been very different. Next slide, please. The first settlers to an area would typically lay claim to more land than they could clear, let alone farm. So he or she would then sell the uncleared land cheaply to new arrivals or even give it away for free, as this man's testimony indicates. He says, "I remember well, I was 19 years old. I was born in 1968, so it was 1987 more or less. I started working as a cook on a large coca farm that had 22 workers. And what did we make to eat? Our breakfast was noodles with sardines, rice, and potatoes. The man didn't grow plantain or yucca because he said it was a waste of time and better to plant a coca bush. I worked as a cook for 1.5 years, and he paid me 90,000 pesos a month. That man saw that I was motivated, and he said, I'm going to give you a bit of land, 70 hectares. He said, take it from this stream and widen to there. Did he ask for something, a payment for the land, we asked? No, that's why they called that man the chief. He was the first to arrive in the place. He and 2 others had arrived in this territory to clear state lands, and because they had arrived first, they decided, when they saw a good person with the will to work, they agreed amongst themselves to give him a bit of land. And so the conversation goes on. We said, well, why would people give away land for free? And for frontier settlers, the answer is obvious. The first to arrive wanted the population to grow, so there would be more hands to help build a school, dig a path or road, so there would be more money to buy a chainsaw or motorboat for the community, so there would be others to turn to in the case of emergency, and even so there'd be someone to talk to and spend time with. And besides, some of them would say, what would anyone do with so much land? Kind of putting the question back to us. So initial land concentration never lasted long. If settlers didn't share their land, new arrivals would simply go further into the jungle and stake out a claim of their own. And this suited neither. People wanted and needed to have neighbors. Next slide, please. So the vast majority of people we met, including those born in Putumayo, established their farms with coca earnings. They worked as sharecroppers, day laborers, harvesters, or cooks on other people's coca farms until they had saved enough to acquire land and plant a crop of their own. This is the typical story of settlers and second-generation migrants from the 1980s onwards. Few and far between had the capital to purchase, clear, and plant land outright. Some were given land for free, as we already discussed, and sellers would often accept deferred payment for the land without interest because they knew that coca was a good guarantee of the buyer's ability to pay. Neighbors often helped newcomers in other ways too, by lending them tools, giving them coca seeds or cuttings, and offering them yucca and plantain to eat. But, you know, no matter how generous the people in a hamlet, establishing a farm from scratch is costly and time-consuming, and most have to save to cover these basic costs. And work in the coca economy enabled them to do this, enabled them to save. Camilo, can you give me a thumbs up to let me know you can hear me okay? Okay, good. I'm gonna just double checking because I had some issues before. Next slide, please. So the dynamics of land access, have been changing. Land prices have been going up in many areas. Those who want land for free or very cheaply have to now go much further east and even into neighboring municipality Puerto Leguizamo. Some do this, often with the aim of saving up coca earnings to buy land later in a more central location. But such ventures are not for the faint-hearted. Most people prefer to live in areas that have already been settled, and there are still a lot of people in these areas, in the populated parts of the municipality, who have more land than they can work and who are willing to sell at reasonable prices. This is partly because farmers are able to earn a decent income with 1 or 2 hectares of coca, and the cost of production and counter-narcotics operations also create disincentives and obstacles to growing more than this. So in contrast to many illicit sectors like cattle ranching, the coca economy encourages and enables people to live off a small area of land, as the quotes on the slide show. The first one says, look, to have more than enough food or your basic needs met, it's a turn of phrase, 1 hectare will do. You don't need more than that. Anything above that is for saving. With 1 hectare, you can do the work yourself. You have to find a harvester to do harvest work, but the rest you can do yourself. The second one says, I am not someone who dreams of having a lot of coca, of planting 5 or 6 hectares. No, one can't nowadays. Having a lot is difficult. The workers, paying them to collect Each arroba, or 12.5 kilos of leaves, costs 8,000, and other day labor costs 30,000. And the food to feed them is expensive, and the gasoline for processing is expensive too, and so is the acid. Everything one needs for processing is expensive, so having a lot means spending a lot of money. In contrast, if you have just a little, you do better. Next slide, please. Furthermore, land in Puerto Asis is mostly still valued as a means of production more than a financial asset. And this is unfortunately changing in some areas because of the oil economy. But anyway, one reason for this is the comparative lack of elite interest in the region. There are a few cases of elite land grabs and speculative hoarding, but nothing like the marked rural property accumulation that has occurred elsewhere in Colombia. That said, it is possible that an elite-led land rush in Lower Putumayo is looming. Next slide, please. For the time being, however, land prices are still accessible, so long as the farm in question isn't too close to municipal capital. In one hamlet, which is just 60 minutes away from the town on a motorbike, at least in the dry season when the dirt road is in a decent condition, a hectare costs between 1 and 2 million pesos in 2020. This is equivalent of between 1.1 and 2.3 months of minimum wage earnings. Importantly, casual waged work, especially coca picking, still pays enough for the landless to save and purchase their own plot, even if it's just a small one to start with. We met a young man, not older than 20, who had been in Putumayo for less than 2 years and had already purchased 1.5 hectares and established his own coca crop, all with money he earned in waged work. And his story isn't unusual. So to reiterate, as of 2020, a landless laborer in Puerto Asis could buy his or her own plot and become an independent coca producer in less than 2 years. Unfortunately, existing land-based social relations in Puerto Asis hinge on a precarious balance of factors. If land prices continue to rise relative to real wages, the coca economy may be reorganized around a stable population of landless workers and thus lose the remarkable, if imperfect, but still remarkable democratic traits it has had until now. Next slide. So we hope our presentation helped you get a sense of Lower Putumayo, past and present, and a sense of how borderland biographies allow us to understand drug economies in a relational way with other processes like state building, land relations, and war. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. I believe we have about 10 minutes left for Q&A. I do not see any questions.
No.
Maybe people need a break from the screen. It's been a long day, hasn't it?
Just a reminder that if you want to ask a question, there's the Q&A tab at the top. So we'll just give that another 30 seconds. And if not, people can head back to the expo area and then back to main stage at 11:30. But we'll just give it another 30 seconds and see if people got questions.
Please do check out the Expo tab because there's quite a few interesting things there, including some photos by a colleague at the Nacional, Diego. There's voices from the Borderlands, the comics and animations. Yeah, there's quite a few things in there, so please do check it out. Kat, our colleague, took quite a bit of time putting it together, and I think it looks really nice. So, oh yeah, Kat said that too. Please visit the Expo booth. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, and people probably need a break. Oh, Teo says question. 1 second. We thought we were going to get off easy. About this discourse about state absence, have you spoken about this with colleagues from other countries? Yeah, so I know that are definitely, in the case of Myanmar, one of the sort of central arguments that the Myanmar team has been making is that sort of contradicting this idea that to solve the sort of illicit drugs trade, what you need is more integration of marginal regions into this into the central state and the economy. And what they show is that Kachin and Shan state have become increasingly integrated or into the central state, but also into the global economy in the last, I think since the 1990s. I'm not an expert on Myanmar, but as I recall, since the 1990s, and actually that drug production and drug use have basically increased during this time. So during the relative stability of the ceasefire period before what's happened recently, obviously, there was a huge increase of or resurgence of the drug economy. So I guess that's kind of also speaking to this discourse about, you know, they're challenging this idea that the problem is the absence of the state or the absence of the market, which very much informs policy there as well, like the China's opium policy. I'm trying to see, Camilo, do you have anything to add? I can't see if there's any other questions.
No, just maybe to emphasize, to try to highlight what I think is our main pitch there in the article, is that what people is saying is that they expect a different relation with the state. So they don't want just these all forms of persecution coming not only from the war on drugs or from the anti-drugs agencies, but also from different agencies of the state that are persecuting them for several reasons. What cocaleros are demanding is a different treatment, and that different treatment involves, for example, the presence of other agencies and a different way in to deal with their problems and their demands. So, yeah.
I just saw another question from Hector Santos. And he asked if there were any good experiences, we noticed and identified any good experiences related to the implementation of legal activities as an alternative to coca cultivation. And if so, what are the relevant things to consider for public policies? So I'll let Camilo come in too after I say something quickly, but I think, for example, people quite liked black pepper, not peppers, but black pepper, you know, the condiment. But the thing was that that worked well when the price was high, and then the price collapsed. And then, so that would be kind of part of any policy that would work would basically have to fix prices, which goes against the neoliberal rules about how market economies have to work. Would be going back to, I mean, you know, 1970s policies where governments kind of controlling prices. So as soon as the pepper price collapsed, then I saw lots of pepper farms where the pepper's just rotting. It's just sitting there rotting. The other problem they had with pepper was the question of intermediaries and basically, you know, again, the question of certificates. One guy said he got a condiments company in Medellin. He got contacts with them. The guy was really interested. He said the Amazonian pepper tastes great. But then he said, oh, have you got all the relevant certificates, like sanitary certificates? So that became a problem, which is something we mentioned in the presentation. I don't know if you want to add to that, Camilo.
No, I don't think so. I mean, in general, Puerto Asis and Putumayo has been a experimental region for all kinds of alternative development programs, at least since the 1990s, and most of them have failed for several reasons. And the most recent experience, which was something that Maria Alejandra Vélez was talking about, which is the pennies, is also following the same path. At least I think that 10,000 cocaleros joined that program, but nowadays they're still waiting for the so-called productive projects for them to implement in their farms. So there's a lot of things that we have to discuss about the idea of alternative development, not only in Colombia, but in general, because as Jonathan mentioned in the keynote of this event, there's this idea of pushing for, let's say, taking the state to the regions and supposedly giving some small credits and some, let's say, products for the peasants to grow and wait. That will be the great solution. In general, it has failed all over the world. It has also had like a couple of successful experiences, which was, I think, Thailand and maybe a couple more, but no more than that. So probably I think that we need to engage in other kind of ideas about how to deal with this problem. But I think that there are a couple of other questions in there, Francis.
Yes. So Mary asks, did you find any indication that patterns of drug use have increased or changed in Putumayo? So we didn't study drug use in any detail. So I cannot tell you if it increased or changed. What I can tell you is just anecdotal things, like what people said in interviews, but it's not quantifiable. You know, we didn't measure, we don't know if it actually increased. But people's perception was that since the FARC demobilization, that drug use had increased. That's what people would tell us, because the FARC used to have quite very strict rules about drug use and control drug use in the region. So a lot of people, you know, did emphasize in interviews that, oh, since the FARC left, no one's controlling this, and all the young guys are taking drugs now. So, but like I said, we don't have the quantitative evidence to sustain that. Oh, and 2 minutes for the last question, which is a difficult one, from Anthony Dest. How do the Cocaleros demands relate to the struggles in indigenous people in the region? So this is a tricky one to answer. I did some interviews with the NASA community in Putumayo, but the NASA are very different from other groups in Putumayo in the sense that the NASA are themselves migrants. So the NASA, they have resguardos and they have cabildos, but they actually themselves migrated from other regions, and they actually have conflicts with other indigenous groups. So it kind of depends on the indigenous group that you're referring to. The NASA, for example, have allied often with the campesinos, with the colonos, the mestizos. They often work together in protests and things. And they were part of the Mesa Regional, the social sort of organizations roundtable. But I think the relationship is very different with other indigenous groups who are autochthonous, if that's the right word, who are actually from there originally. And I cannot give you the details because it's not something I've looked into, but I think there is conflict, basically. There are land conflicts and there are problems. So it's 4:30 exactly. Thank you so much, everyone, for sticking around and for all the questions at the end. And we shall see you tomorrow and the next session is on stage. So we're going back to the main stage.